Hello everyone and welcome back to Psychology 300, Research Methods in Psychology. I'm Dr. Williams and Chapter 7 is about conducting surveys. Today we're going to be talking about sampling techniques. This is Lecture 7D. So let's start by talking about some basic sampling terms so that we can understand each other as we go through the discussion about how we go about sampling for our surveys. So one of the first terms that you need to be aware of is the term population. It refers to all the members of a particular group that you've defined as the target for your survey. When you sample the entire population, we call that a census. When you ask a representative sample, then we call it a survey. So when we refer to the population, those are the people that we're interested in, but the actual surveys themselves, then what we call them depends on who we're sampling. If we're asking everyone, we call it a census. If we ask just a subset that's representative of the larger whole, we call it a survey. The sampling frame is a specific list of all the members of the population. So it could be the phone book, it could be the list of students currently enrolled at Central. That specific list that you choose to use is called the sampling frame. And they're not always accurate. If I use all homeowners listed on a registry with the city of Ellensburg, it may be that there are people who own property but have trailers on them. There may be people who own homes but don't live there. So it could be that there are problems. So sampling frames are always an issue, and you have to sort of know what the limitations are for that particular sampling frame that you've chosen. So for example, a register of all currently enrolled students, well, what about students who are abroad, or those who are on internship, or those who have taken a temporary leave? So, you know, there could be students, what about does that include all the students that are online? So you have to find out where the limitations are and make sure that you refer to them in your paper when you finish your survey. And then the last term on this page is element, which is really just a member of the population. So we refer to them as elements, whether we're talking about biology, or we're talking about frogs in a pond, or whether we're talking about people who are being surveyed for a psychological survey. So when I say element, sometimes I'll say people, other times I'll say elements. So just so you know. Another term is representativeness. So the degree to which your sample, the people that you're actually surveying, represent the larger population, they're a good representation of your population. Then how representative your sample is dictates how generalizable your results are. When you have biased samples, you have poor generalizability. And then the last term I want to talk about is selection bias, which are procedures that are used to select a sample that result in non-representative samples. So when you are selecting your population, there may be a particular subset of individuals in the population that you are unaware of and neglect, or the way in which you're selecting leaves particular subgroups out. And so when we talk about selection bias, that's what we're talking about. Okay, so let's go on to talking about sampling methods. Most survey sampling is not really random. We either use probability sampling or we use non-probability sampling. True random sampling is very difficult to do when your population is very, very large, which is often what we do when we're looking for, when we use surveys that are trying to sample from a large, diverse, possibly really spread out population. We can't really use true random sampling. So we use probability sampling or non-probability sampling. Probability sampling simply means that every element or every person in the population has the same chance of being included in the survey. So the probability of being included is equal for everyone. Non-probability sampling means that each element has a different probability of being chosen and is usually determined by the way in which we sample. So, and we're going to talk about different types of each of these. All right, so probability sampling, each person has the same probability of being included in the sample. And we can use simple random sampling. Certainly you could do random sampling if your population is very, very small or very localized. You might be able to do random sampling. More often than not, we use other kinds of probability sampling like stratified random sampling and cluster sampling. Stratified sampling is simply where you take your population and you divide it into strata or categories, and random samples are drawn from each of those populations. So one of the reasons for using a stratified random sample is to make sure, for example, that the ethnic balance of your surveyed individuals is representative of, for example, of the ethnicity balance in your larger population. And I'll talk about cluster sampling a little bit later. But let me show you an example of a stratified, we'll go into stratified samples a little bit more. A stratified random sample is basically the population is divided into subgroups, and they call those strata. And one level is called a stratum, but all of them together are called strata. And you can divide your population by gender. So you could say we're going to have males and we're going to have females, and then randomly select from those populations so that you have the same proportion of males to females in your sample that you have in the population. You can do this by gender, you can do it by ethnicity, you could do it by sexual orientation, you could do it by religion, you could do it by educational level. So you divide out your groups and then you randomly select from each strata. And usually the number of people from each strata can be limited to their representation in the population. So for example, let me show you an example here. Here are according to the Pew Research Center, in 2012, the size of major religious groups in America were, the religions are on the left, and I think this is actually in the world, religions on the left, percent on the right, Christianity, Muslim, unaffiliated, Hindu, Buddhist, folk religions, other, and Jewish. And so if I were going to be doing a study and using this set of percentages, then I would take my population, I would divide my strata according to these religious groups, and I would draw 30.7% of my survey from the Christian group, 23.2% from the Muslim group, 16.3% from the unaffiliated group, so on and so forth. And so that's how you would use a randomized stratified random sample. The nice thing is that when you do this, when you're dealing with, for example, the Christian population, every Christian in your population has an equal chance of being chosen relative to every other Christian. And every Muslim has an equal chance of being included relative to other Muslims, and so on and so forth. If you were to just randomly choose and say, I need 30%, when you get to 30% Christians, you stop, then you're not really offering all Christians an equal opportunity relative to other Muslims. You would be picking Muslims and not giving the Christians an equal sample. And actually, mathematically, this plays out. You end up with very different results, whether you do just a random sample and limit the percentages, or whether you do a stratified sample. Stratified sampling leads to more accurate information about the population. All right. Cluster sampling is a type of probability sampling. The researcher can identify pre-existing clusters of potential participants, and then you select from those clusters. So it's like a stratified sample, but instead of selecting individuals, you select actual clusters of individuals. So for example, I might be interested in sampling Psychology 300 classes offered in 2015 and 2016. So what I would do is I would select which classes I'm going to include as a possibility, and the classes themselves are the clusters, and then I would randomly select a subset of clusters. So maybe there are 20 sections of Psychology 300 being offered in that one academic year, and I want to select five. I want to select 5 of them. Then I would select 5 of those classes. I wouldn't select the individuals. I would just select the classes, and then I would survey the students in those classes. So we're actually sampling by chunks of people rather than by individuals. Cluster sampling is used when other sampling methods are too laborious. They're usually conducted in stages. So, for example, if you were doing a really big study and you wanted to include research method students, I would first use a cluster sample to select which states I was going to use. And so I might select a state or several states. And then within each state, I might do a cluster sampling of universities and select a few universities. And within those, then I would identify the classes and grab those classes and survey those individuals. So the advantage is that the individual participants are not randomly selected. They just are selected by virtue of being in a particular cluster. All right, sampling techniques, non-probability sampling. There's haphazard sampling. We also call it convenient sampling, which you're familiar with. Purposive sampling, where the sample meets a predetermined criterion of what you might need, and quota sampling, where the sample reflects the numerical composition of various subgroups in the population. So where you're filling quotas. Now, again, the difference between quota sampling and stratified random sampling. Stratified random sampling is actually a probability method and produces better results than quota sampling. With non-probability sampling, each person has a different probability of being chosen. So accidental sampling, you select people on the basis of availability or their willingness to respond, or it might be a television poll or a telephone survey, and the people who respond are the ones that you get. People could participate in your survey for a lot of reasons. You might be offering incentives or money, and that might get certain people to participate. Maybe they're interested in the particular topic that you're surveying, and so they participate, but people who are not interested don't participate, or because they have a particular viewpoint. So accidental sampling tends to be biased in terms of who participates in the survey. In this case, each person has a different probability of being chosen. Purposive sampling, people are included on the basis of having special characteristics. So I might include parents of children with autism. That's not going to represent all parents. They're going to be very specific. I might be sampling college professors, and the topics might be relevant to them, but not to other people, or doctors who were trained abroad. So this is non-probability sampling. You can't generalize to all children, all parents of children with disabilities if I'm only using children with autism. I can't refer to all teachers if I've only used college professors. I can't refer to all doctors if I'm surveying doctors who were trained abroad. So one of the potential problems with sampling is that flawed surveys often reflect poor sampling methods. So sampling bias can come in two places. It can happen at the level of the sampling frame, the technique, the list that you choose to pull people out of, and the way in which you select your sample. There can be bias during the sampling frame because you're using phone directories for the general population that doesn't actually include everyone. Maybe you're using subscribers to a magazine, but the magazine is a particular type, and that might introduce a type of bias. Or it can happen at the level of a sample where you use a mail survey, and so only certain people mail it back, and they sort of self-select. Calls made to college students on Friday and Saturday nights. Whoever answers their cell phone is different from people who don't answer their cell phone, so you have a problem there. And they're all different from people who don't even have a cell phone. So any study in which the subjects select themselves in terms of participation is potentially problematic. It doesn't mean that you can't do it that way, but when you list the limitations of your survey, you need to list what these potential biasing agents are so that the consumers of this information in your survey understand where the limitations actually lie. Okay, that's really all I'm going to talk about surveys. We will see you again in the next lecture. Have a good day.